guys, it's Chef Andrea with A Chef's Cooking Studio. It's Q&A with Chef A, and we are deep diving into butter in this series of pods. Okay, we've talked about clarified butter versus ghee. We have talked about salted versus unsalted. So now what I want to mention to you is when butter is asked to be chilled or melted or room temperature in a recipe, does it really matter? Short answer, long answer. Okay, I want to make this recipe. I get home from work. I realize that it calls for room temperature butter, but my butter's ice cold. Can I just melt it instead? No. Okay, I come home from work and I want to make this recipe, and I see that it calls for room temperature butter. My butter's ice cold. Can I just use it ice cold? No. I have room temperature butter because I keep it in a butter keeper on the counter, and the recipe I'm doing this afternoon calls for chilled butter. Can I just use room temperature? No. I have a recipe that calls for chilled butter, but I don't, and then it says to chop it up and put it back in the fridge. Then it says to work it into the dough and put the dough back in the fridge, but I don't have time for all that. Even if the butter starts to melt while I work with it, will it be okay? No. So there you go. Can I use melted butter in place of room temp? Nope. Can I use room temp in place of cold? Nope. If it calls for cold butter and it starts to get room temp, can I carry on anyway? Nope. Here's what, guys. This is one of those places where science takes place a little bit in our kitchen. When you look at a recipe and it calls for butter, I want you to be really clear about what it's asking for in the way of butter. Room temp or chilled or melted, because it's actually going to have a big difference in the final texture of whatever it is you're producing. Not only its batter or base, but also in its final texture when it comes out of the oven. So let's talk about chilled butter and what that is and when you'll see that. Recipes that are calling for chilled butter are almost without exception going to fall into the category of short dough or pastry in some form. So these are doughs that are, think about pie dough. You're looking at something, or puff pastry, you're looking at something that has a flakiness to it. And the reason the chilled butter, also biscuits use chilled butter typically, although I do have a couple that use room temp Crisco. But pie dough is a really good example. When you're looking for that flaky, light crust, I do a short dough, like a shortbread cookie. That always wants really chilled butter. And cold means cold, like straight out of the fridge, super duper cold. P.S. It doesn't necessarily mean frozen. I don't ever freeze my butter. I worry that the water, I may be crazy, but I always worry that might bring too much water to the show. But chilled is just chilled, as cold as your refrigerator is. And what's happening with recipes that call for cold butter is typically you're doing a process of cutting the butter into a dry mix, maybe flour, a little bit of sugar. In the case of something like a shortbread, there might be some baking soda or baking powder in it. But the butter itself, stick of butter, cut it into small pieces, chill it again, throw it into your dry ingredients, and you can either use a tool that's called a pastry blender, which kind of looks like, what does it look like to me? Like a bow and arrow, you know, it's kind of bow shaped, and it has kind of like guitar strings on it, and you just run it through the butter and the flour mixture and create these small little bits of butter within the flour. That's a process called cutting butter into flour. I actually do it with my hands. I use a snapping technique, and I just get the butter floury and my hands floury, and I just snap the butter through my fingers until it's just all combined up into the dry ingredients. You can use two knives like my mom does. That's dark magic. I have no idea how she does that, but two knives, beep, beep, beep. The idea behind the pastry blender and the two knives is that your hands generate enough heat that just by touching the butter, you can actually get it warmer than what they're really asking for, which is chilled butter. Why on earth does it need to be so chilled? The reason is that if you'll look at a recipe that calls for specifically for chilled butter, I'm willing to bet your baking temperature is 400 degrees or higher. And the reason I'm willing to bet that is because what we're trying to do by keeping the butter chilled in any recipe like that, a baking recipe, is that when the final product goes into the hot oven, the cold butter instantly turns to steam in that very hot oven. And the steam is what flakes and puffs up the layers of dough. So whether that be biscuits that we're looking for some puffiness in, or scones, or pie dough that we're looking for that little flake in the bottom of that crust. So typically when I see very chilled butter in a recipe, I see a high cook temp as well. 400 to 450 degrees is pretty typical. So chilled butter. What happens if the butter starts to soften while I'm working it in? Chill the whole process. Get it off your fingers, get the whole bowl back into the refrigerator and give it 15 minutes. It needs to be chilled and it needs to stay chilled. So this might take a few rounds for you. I've seen a tip recently that I think is kind of kooky, but I guess it could work. It just seems like a lot of work to me. Where I think they froze the stick of butter and then grated the frozen stick of butter on a box grater to create these little nuggets of butter that then they could just bounce around their flour and carry on with the recipe. I think if you're somebody whose home is always warm, whose hands are always warm, and this is just something you constantly battle, every time you go to make pie dough, you know for a fact that you're melting the butter because the room temp in your house is just too hot for this process. You know, pastry kitchens are chilly. They're like surgical units, those pastry kitchens. I mean, stainless steel as far as you can see, cool air blowing in on everything. If that's not quite your home kitchen, I could see maybe the frozen stick of butter on the box grater would work. It's also why, by the way, so many of these short doughs, these flaky doughs, are made in a food processor. Then you don't touch it. Right? You can just put your cold chunks of butter in with your flour and whatever else and pop, pop, pop in the food processor, and it does all the work of cutting the butter in for you. So chilled butter for recipes that called for it absolutely needs to be chilled. Room temperature butter. Do you know, I didn't really understand this until I went to culinary school. I had been doing this essentially wrong for all of my teens and 20s. Room temperature butter is room temperature, not 1 hour out of the fridge. In culinary school, our very first day of culinary school, at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, all the floors were mopped and squeegeed, everything was spotless, and the last thing we did was set down a full sheet pan and set about 12 pounds of butter on it and left for the night. We needed room temperature butter for a recipe that we were going to be working the next day. And room temperature, our chef wanted us to leave it out overnight. In an air-conditioned kitchen, it's going to take several hours to get it to room temperature. So room temp is no joke. It's room temp. So the reason behind a room temperature butter would be that you're trying to create a texture of something that's got both a little bit of a cakiness to it as well as some chew. So here's where I see room temperature butter often, is if I'm creaming it into a batter that's going to be like a cookie dough. You know how cookies are kind of chewy and cakey at the same time? So room temperature butter for that. Very dense batters like your pound cake. Pound cake often calls for room temperature butter. Side note, I've had a lot of customers ask me, how come about 1 in 3 pound cakes that I make, when I go to slice it, these little rivulets of butter start pouring out? Your butter wasn't room temperature is the answer. Your butter was still too cold. You rushed that 3rd pound cake. You've made 3 in the last month, and 2 of them that didn't happen, and the 3rd one it did. You rushed the last one. If that butter was cold when it went into the pound cake batter, some little portions of it just never worked into the batter, and then when they went into the oven in that, kind of low bake, they started to just melt. So room temperature is room temperature. If I need room temperature butter, boy, in my house, it really has to be out of the refrigerator overnight. My house stays pretty cold. I live in Florida. It's the tropics. We have the AC blowing all the time. Have you been to a restaurant in Florida? They're chilly. Bring a jacket. My house is the same way. But because it's so hot here. We just have to have the AC going all the time. But likewise, I suppose if you lived in a home in northern Scotland, it's probably always freezing there. You might have to not only pull your butter out well in advance, but move it someplace, get it over closer to the fire or near an oven that's on low or something like that. So room temp, it really genuinely means room temp. What does that mean? It means that it isn't melted. You shouldn't see butter pooling around it. It'll hold in the form of a stick, but it will absolutely, you can run a finger just directly through it to the table. Boom, right through it. Room temp. Side note, cream cheese that's asked to be room temperature, same thing. There's some theories that one of the reasons that cheesecakes crack so badly in the oven is that people aren't getting their cream cheese room temp, that they're using it actually still cold out of the fridge. So room temp for something like that too. And then melted butter. Where is melted butter going to come in? Melted butter is going to come in when we're looking for a very specific texture, like the internal crumb of a cake, like a birthday cake, right? Sometimes that's where I'll see melted butter gets worked into something along those lines. And I don't think any of us have any trouble with melting butter. I think the bigger confusion at home is going to be with room temp. What that really means, an hour out of the fridge is usually not the answer. And cold, how cold? Super cold. Those flaky pastries, they're really relying on that ice cold butter to hit that hot oven and evaporate into steam and create that puff and flakiness. So does it matter? There's the short answer. I think the answer is absolutely yes. Follow your recipe. There's a reason for it. And give yourself some time if it calls for room temperature butter. If you get home from work and your butter's not room temp, personally I say it's time to do a different recipe, but leave that butter out on the counter overnight and you can make that recipe tomorrow. One side note, butter at room temperature. I always use salted butter, which you can find the podcast that we've done on salted versus unsalted butter to hear a little bit more about that. I use salted butter, and salted butter is more stable. Salt is a natural preservative, so I keep my butter, at least a stick of butter, in a butter keeper, which I have the greatest butter keeper thanks to one of my students here. Jenny gave me this gorgeous butter keeper. I'll put a picture of it up here for you guys, and it's a butter crock, and you just put your room temperature butter in it, and then it turns over and goes into another ceramic container, and then you pour a little water around it. Water is an excellent airtight seal, and so it just keeps it airtight. And then you always have this butter just ready to spread right on toast or whatever. So I love always having some room temperature butter. But if I'm baking, I have to get even more butter out of the refrigerator. I usually don't have enough to do a recipe just sitting waiting to go. So plan ahead. But people are worried about keeping butter on the counter. Salted butter does fine. Here, maybe 10 days, 2 weeks, something like that. It will go bad eventually, don't get me wrong. And I say here, meaning in Florida. This is a hot climate. We have to be careful about that. So there's that. Does it matter? It does. Follow your recipe. There's a reason behind it. Plan ahead if it needs to be room temperature. All right, that's what I got for you on that one. Looking forward to some more questions from you guys. Please feel free to put them into the comments, or you can always email me questions as well. achefs.com is a good place to email me. Check out our website. I hope you guys have enjoyed the podcast that we've been doing. I hope that you will consider subscribing to us. And if you found us on YouTube, definitely give us a thumbs up. And looking forward to more Q&A with Chef A with you guys very soon. I hope you're having a delicious day.